Hamilton Howard Fish was born in Washington, D.C. on May 19, 1870. He would later become infamously known as Albert, a name he wished to be known as after a dead sibling, and to escape the unsavoury nicknames that he was given at an orphanage in which he spent much of his childhood. Albert was born into an unconventional family. His father had been 43 years older than his mother and was 75 years old at the time of Albert's birth, suffering a fatal heart attack just 5 years later. It was here that Albert's mother had placed him into the St. John's Orphanage in Washington, where he was frequently physically abused. Albert, however, found that he had begun to enjoy the physical pain that the beatings brought on. Mental illness ran rife in Albert's family. Those closest to him suffered from a range of illnesses such as mania, schizophrenia, mental afflictions and hallucinations. Perhaps it had been his environment, or perhaps it was just in his blood. But by 1882, at the age of 12, Albert had begun a relationship with another boy, and this boy had introduced Albert to strange and unusual practices, such as urolagnia, the act of drinking urine, and coprophagia, the act of eating feces. This seemed to kickstart what would lead to Albert in later years being labelled as the Grey Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, and the Boogeyman. In his youth, Albert had also begun visiting public baths where he could watch the other boys undress, spending a great portion of his weekends on these visits. As he got older, he would spend a great deal of time writing obscene letters to women whose names he had acquired from newspapers. By 1890, at the age of 20, Albert had moved to New York City. There, he engaged in male prostitution and had begun molesting and sexually assaulting young boys, mostly younger than 6 years old. In 1898, Albert's mother had arranged a marriage for him to a lady called Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 9 years his junior. The pair went on to have 6 children together. This, however, did not deter Albert from his perverse and sadistic lifestyle. At some point, a male lover of Albert's had taken him to a museum where he had become fascinated by a bisection of a male genitalia and subsequently became obsessed with sexual mutilation. Around 1910, Albert was working in Wilmington, Delaware, where he met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Cadden. He took Cadden to where he was staying, and the two began a sadomasochistic relationship involving acts of inflicting pain or humiliation upon one another. It is unclear whether or not Albert forced Cadden to do these things, but his later confession implied that Cadden was intellectually disabled. After 10 days, Albert took Cadden to an old farmhouse, where he tortured him over a period of 2 weeks. Albert eventually tied Cadden up and cut off half of his genitalia. I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me, Albert later recalled. He originally intended to kill Cadden, cut up his body and take it home, but he feared the hot weather would draw attention to him, and instead, Albert poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in Vaseline, covered it in a handkerchief, left a $10 bill, and kissed Cadden goodbye. After he left, he took a train home and never heard of what had become of Thomas Cadden. In January of 1917, Albert's wife had left him for a handyman who had boarded with the Fish family. Albert then had to raise his children as a single parent. His mental state had begun to worsen around this time, and he began to have auditory hallucinations, once wrapping himself in a carpet, saying that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. Albert had also begun to indulge in self-harm by embedding needles into his groin and abdomen. X-rays would soon reveal that he had at least 29 needles lodged inside his pelvic region. He also hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle and inserted wool doused with lighter fluid inside himself and set it alight. While Albert was never thought to have physically abused or attacked his children, he did encourage them and their friends to paddle him with the same nail-studded paddle he used to abuse himself. It is believed that he got sexual gratification from this. It was perhaps inevitable that Albert's behaviour would soon escalate, and the time bomb for his first murder was ticking. Around 1919, Albert stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown. He decided to choose people who were either mentally disabled or African American as his victims, later explaining that he assumed these people would not be missed once killed. A tactic he would use to secure victims would be to pay boys to procure other children for him. He would then go on to torture, mutilate and kill, with what he liked to call his implements of hell: a meat cleaver, a butcher's knife, and a small handsaw. On July the 11th of 1924, Albert wandered across 8-year-old Beatrice Keel, playing alone on her parents' farm on Staten Island, New York. He offered her money to come away and help him look for rhubarb. She was about to leave the farm when her mother chased Albert away. Just 3 days after this incident, Albert killed 9-year-old Frances McDonnell, also on Staten Island. During 1924, the now 54-year-old Albert Fish suffered from psychosis and felt like God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children. The child had been reported missing after he failed to return home after playing catch with friends. A search had been organised and his body was found hanging by a tree in a wooded area near to his home. He had been sexually assaulted and strangled with his suspenders. According to an autopsy, Francis had also suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and abdomen, and his left hamstring had almost entirely been stripped of its flesh. Albert refused to claim responsibility for this, although he later stated that he intended to castrate the boy, but fled when he heard someone approaching the area. Francis's friends told the police that he was taken by an elderly man with a grey moustache. Francis's mother, Anna McDonnell, said that she saw the same man earlier that day, telling reporters, "He came shuffling down the street mumbling to himself and making queer motions with his hands. I saw his thick grey hair and his drooping grey moustache. Everything about him seemed faded and grey. This is what led to one of Albert's media titles, being the Grey Man." On February the 11th, 1927, 3-year-old Billy Beaton and his 12-year-old brother were playing in an apartment hallway in Brooklyn with their 4-year-old friend, Billy Gaffney. When the 12-year-old left for his apartment, both younger boys had disappeared. Beaton was later found on the roof of the apartments, and when asked what happened to Billy Gaffney, Beaton said, "The bogeyman took him." Initially, serial killer Peter Kudzinowski was a suspect in Gaffney's murder. Then, Joseph Meehan, a man on a Brooklyn trolley, saw a picture of Albert Fish in the newspaper and identified him as the old man who he had seen on February the 11th. The old man had been trying to quiet a little boy with him on the trolley. The boy was not wearing a jacket and was crying for his mother, and he was dragged on and off the trolley by the old man. Beaton's description of the boogeyman matched Albert Fish, and police later matched the description of the child on the trolley to that of Billy Gaffney. Albert later wrote a letter to his attorney admitting what he did to the little boy, noting that he had taken him to an abandoned farmhouse, stripped him and tied his hands and feet, and gagged him with a dirty rag. Using a cat of 9 tails that he had made himself from an old belt, he had whipped the child until blood ran down his legs. He then cut off Francis's ears and nose and slit his mouth from ear to ear. Albert then claimed to have stuck a knife into the child's stomach and drank his blood before dismembering him. Albert went on in his letter to go into graphic detail about how he had taken the child's body parts home and cooked them with a meal. The murder in which Albert would become infamously known for, however, was yet to come. This was the murder of a little girl by the name of Grace Budd. Albert would go undetected for 6 years after this killing. However, it would be a bold letter in which he had sent to the child's mother that would be the beginning of Albert's downfall, and would eventually see his long reign of terror come to an end. Shortly before his abduction of Grace Budd, Albert had attempted to test his implements of hell on a child he had been molesting, named Cyril Quinn. Quinn and his friend had been playing box ball on a sidewalk when Albert asked them if they had eaten lunch. When they said that they had not, he invited them back to his apartment for sandwiches, and whilst the two boys were wrestling on Albert's bed, they dislodged his mattress. Underneath was the knife, the small handsaw, and the meat cleaver. The children became frightened and ran out of the apartment. On May the 28th of 1928, Albert Fish would arrive to 406 West 15th Street in Manhattan. The Brooklyn vampire himself had responded to a classified ad placed by 18-year-old Edward Budd, Grace's older brother, who'd been looking for work. A supposed farmer, Albert identified himself as Frank Howard and would fully integrate himself with the family over the coming weeks and charm them enough to take 10-year-old Grace to his niece's birthday party. Grace was dressed in her finest clothes when she left her home with Albert Fish, hand in hand. The seemingly friendly old man agreed to bring her back promptly, and he promised Edward that not only would his job pay him $15 per hour, but that his friend would also be hired. He claimed that he would return to discuss those details further. Neither the man that the Budd family had known as Frank Howard, nor little Grace, would ever return. Instead, Albert Fish had taken Grace to an abandoned house in Westchester County, where he undressed to prevent blood from splattering onto his clothes before luring her upstairs. Stripping her naked, he strangled the child to death and cut her into chunks small enough to bake inside his oven. The Budd family would not know anything about this until 6 years later, when a disturbing unsigned letter had arrived for them on November the 11th, 1934. The letter was long and gruesome, and rambled on about how a friend of his had once sailed to Hong Kong, and due to the famine in China, children of the poor had been sold to butchers' shops to be cut up and sold for food, in order to keep others from starving. He stated in the letter, "A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out, and just what you wanted cut from it." Albert went on to state in the letter that this friend had returned home with an acquired taste for human flesh, whereupon he had stolen 2 boys, a 7 and an 11-year-old, before torturing them and eating them. After the graphic description was relayed in the letter, Albert went on to taunt Grace's mother by speaking of her own child. He wrote, "On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called upon you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you cheese, strawberries, we had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her." Albert ended the letter with writing an account of Grace's last moments. The letter is too graphic to relay. Almost immediately after receiving Albert Fish's letter, the Budds turned it over to the police. Investigators noticed that the envelope was adorned with a small hexagonal emblem representing a local association for private chauffeurs. They found a janitor at the company's headquarters who admitted to taking home some of the stationery. The landlady revealed that a man named Albert Fish had checked out the now rooming house mere days prior. She agreed to contact him to claim a check was waiting for him. This led Albert to return and authorities to arrest him on December the 13th of 1934. Albert Fish's residence was searched by Sergeant Jerome Hogan of the Greenburgh Police Department and his team, where they stumbled upon a meat cleaver that they believed Albert had used during the murder of Grace Budd. Upon questioning, Albert Fish admitted to Grace Budd's murder and claimed to have killed children all over the country. While he admitted to only killing 3 children, he was suspected of killing up to 9 more. He was, however, only charged for the murder of Grace Budd. His trial began on March the 11th of 1935, and he was sentenced to death within days. Despite psychiatrists arguing that he was mentally unstable, the jury decided that he was guilty. Albert Fish was executed via the electric chair at Sing Sing prison on January the 16th of 1936. During the execution, the needles in his body had acted as electrodes, accelerating his death. Meanwhile, Albert Fish's letter to Grace Budd's family would reportedly pale in comparison to his final statement, as even his lawyer, James Dempsey, could not bear it. "I will never show it to anyone," he said. "It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever seen." As of the present day, it is unknown whether the notes still exist or whether they were destroyed by Dempsey.